Okay, so here's what we're going to do tonight. My experiment is to change the amperage gauge on this gauge cluster to a voltage gauge. This gauge cluster is for Chrysler L bodies circa 1979 to 1983. And back in the 60s and 70s, there was this wonderful fire hazard called an amperage gauge, which had a lot of power going through a tiny wire, and needless to say, it could have been troublesome. I don't recall any instances myself that I know of being troublesome, but I've heard the stories. The idea here is that we take a normal aftermarket voltage gauge of the right size, and we're going to disassemble it to use the parts for this. I don't know how many gauge clusters you could do this with, but this is actually fairly easy. Because when you look at the back, its connections are just these little pinch connections. The pod will pop out, and then what you have there is where it's connected. And then the light just shines around it, which is perfect. So all you then have to do is loosen up these little nuts, and then you can take it out. Like that. Matched up what I thought would be a good counterpart, because these cheapy voltage gauges put power through the two screw connections just like that amperage gauge does. So you buy a gauge, I tested it to make sure it worked, and then I went to disassembling them, which is kind of prying this little lip apart until it pops off. So then, we'll set that aside, and you can see the gauge inside there. And then what you gotta do is take out all the little screws and hardware. And so then you have the screws and hardware and a little paper piece, and then this piece right here. And then you can remove the gauge from the housing. And so now we have a stripped out piece that looks similar to that. And we're going to have to do some trimming. See here, are slightly smaller on the aftermarket gauge than the factory one. So I cut a little chunk out of the plastic there with a wire snippers. And the idea then is that we can simply put this in right where the old one was, like that. And you can see it's a little off, but it'll work. So I'm going to have to do some trimming in the steel. And this size in particular, if I try it over here, I'll do it in the fuel one, it's the same size, you can see will connect right where the factory stuff was. So I'm going to have to trim a little bit off the top so that it clears the corner. And then I think I'm going to take this plate off and trim a little off the bottom so the number. Okay, so I snipped a little more metal out of it. I need two more holes a little higher up so it could sit a little lower. Instead of fighting to drill it, I used the little tiny eyeglass screwdriver they used for the screws and just hit it with a hammer on a piece of wood, and pops holes through that really easy because it's just a piece of thin sheet metal. Trimmed a little top piece out of the corner just to make more space. Mounted it with the hardware that the gauge came with. Snugged in there. There we go. You just see enough of it to give you the information you need. Reading 12 volts. 12 volt battery, so when I disconnect it. Simple enough. So, now we'll take the little voltage pod out of the crappy clock that doesn't work, and we'll put it in the actual car and see how it goes. So, we're going to replace that amperage gauge right there is the plan. Alongside that awesome little clock. Yep, we're going to start by taking out these nifty, scrifty little plastic pins that you just yank out with the pliers. Put those somewhere, we won't lose them. Little pins that are right at the bottom corners here. Because then this just kind of pops out of there. I actually need to find a new one of these pieces because this one, you can probably see here, is actually broken, and I've kind of got it glued, but no matter what, it doesn't stay where it's supposed to. It's broken when I got it, unfortunately. Gone ahead and removed the 4 corner screws that hold this cluster in. Like I said, my car originally had the proper cluster for an 84. This is an older model cluster that I chose to use because I thought it was swanky, more or less. I love the analog clock. I love the silver on orange. It's very retro and neat. The tachometer is less accurate than the already somewhat inaccurate tach that these cars were made with in 84. In fact, they're very easy to move in the wind even. I mean, just the slightest breath. Look at that. It's very cute and tiny and easy to move. And I went ahead and unplugged it. The hardest part, of course, about unplugging these things is you can only move it out so far right off the bat because the speedometer cable's plugged in. And in that you simply have to reach your hand inside there and feel for the tab and squeeze the tab. It's pretty much common in all vehicles that have a cable-driven speedometer, which let me tell you is a lot of vehicles. And then pretty much you get down to the wiring. My rat's nest is not too bad. Everything is labeled from the last time I did this. You might also notice something else that I did to make things easier for me later on, is I actually took my angle grinder and I removed the section of plastic that was kind of in the middle here. It just gives me that much more space to work with. If you can, I strongly suggest taking off the steering wheel when you're doing this stuff, because it makes life a lot easier. For us users of GT wheels, that's actually really easy to take off because you don't have to use a puller. Further example on the lighting, I'll pop one out, and let's see, I've just replaced it with the LED in the normal original socket. Now you can see here, these are the lines that originally went for the voltage gauge, and as you can see they're kind of melted and crappy. And this, I think, does a fairly decent job of explaining the actual fucking fire hazard that I was just talking about. Pardon my French there. Okay, simply take out the 1/4 inch screws out of the two corners of the pod. And then we can simply tug and pull, and it will come right out, just like the other one did. Yep, and then we'll simply loosen those and pop it out. Basically, here's what I did to wire this up. Instead of monkeying with the connector, I took the connector and I snipped the two wires that are going to go to it, and I'm just going to go ahead and tape it all off because one of these is damaged anyways. So what I'm going to do is I actually connected wires to each terminal and ran them over to a ground and a positive feed source. If you don't have a wiring diagram, it takes just a little bit of knowledge and you can trace these wires because you can see them all. So, for example, I have my test light hooked up to a ground, and I know it has a very good positive source, so all I have to do is find my positives. The key is not currently in the on position for the ignition, so the harness won't have positive, but the clock will. So, there's the clock's power, which is always on. In this case, the ignition wire is a dark blue with white stripe, which is fairly common to be dark blue or dark blue with white. When I pinch it in there, it's not currently on. You'll see that we have power. Using this knowledge, we can see that there's the T of the connector, and it is the bottom left if you think of that T as being the top. And it's this plug right here, the T is actually at the bottom, so if we use our thought of flipping it around, it'll be this wire. And if you trace that around, you can see where it goes to positive right here. And I have a negative right here using the same idea, following the negative wire. Turn to the ignition position, we should have gauge activity. There we go. About 11 volts. Hey, I like how jumpy it is. She bounces a little bit, but, you know, it's this type of alternator for me. It's an externally regulated alternator. The later models had a bit better one. If this alternator ever goes out, I'm probably going to convert it to the internally regulated Nippon Denso or Bosch style. So yeah, that's where we're at with that. That all seems to work good. I've got the remote start indicator light using the oxygen sensor light that was never used. as a reminder to me that the remote start system is on. That way I can put the key back in before I stall the engine. So when I hit the brake, the system shuts off. That's all good and check and clear.